Go ahead and settle in now. Pull the blanket up to your chin. Let the last light of the day fade out completely. There is nothing left to do tonight. No decisions, no plans, nowhere to be. Just the quiet weight of the covers and my voice low and slow beside you. Somewhere near you, in the dark, there is probably a piece of clothing you didn't think twice about this morning. A gray sweater, a blue shirt, a pair of black socks tossed over a chair. You chose it without thinking. You put it on the way you breathe, automatically, without asking permission from anyone. But there was a time when that same simple act, choosing a color to wear, could have ended your freedom, emptied your purse, or marked you for the rest of your life. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, an actual, enforceable, written down law. In the medieval world, color was not decoration. Color was a sentence spoken before you ever opened your mouth. A merchant's wife who dared to wear the wrong shade of red could be fined more than her husband earned in a season. A commoner caught in a fragment of true purple silk could be dragged before a magistrate as if he had stolen a crown. And some colors were not chosen at all. They were forced, sewn onto sleeves, tied around necks, stitched into hoods, not to flatter the wearer, but to announce from a distance, before a single word was exchanged, exactly who this person was allowed to be. This is the hidden truth we are stepping into tonight. Not that the medieval world loved beautiful clothing. Not that nobles simply preferred richer colors the way anyone might. But that an entire legal and social system was built around one quiet assumption that a person's worth could be read on sight in a shade of cloth before anyone bothered to learn their name. We tend to think of history as something written in treaties and battles, in kings and councils. We picture parchment, seals, armies moving across a map, the grand and the official. But long before anyone read a document, they read a person's clothes. And clothes, in that world, spoke almost entirely through color. Not through jewelry, not through cut or fabric or fit alone, though those mattered too. Through color. The one thing visible from across a market square. The one thing no crowd, no dim light, no distance could hide. What I want to walk you through tonight is not simply the story of pretty dyes and royal fashion. It is the story of a world where the human body itself became a kind of document, and pigment became its ink. Where a farmer's dull brown wool and a bishop's blood-red robe were not just different tastes. They were different legal categories of person. Where the color on your back could buy you respect you hadn't earned, or brand you with a shame you hadn't chosen. Tonight, we are going to spend time with 4 different threads of this story. The dyers, first, the ones whose hands were stained for life, standing over vats that smelled of rot and salt and something almost unbearable, coaxing color out of shellfish and insects and bark so that others could wear a beauty they themselves would never be allowed to touch. Then purple, a color so rare that an empire once built an entire idea of legitimate birth around it, so tightly guarded that owning the wrong bolt of cloth could be treated, quite seriously, as an act against the throne itself. Then red, not the red of roses, but the red of crushed insects, a color so costly that a single garment could be worth a peasant's entire year of labor, worn by cardinals as holiness and by executioners as terror, the very same shade meaning devotion in one doorway and dread in the next. And then the colors that were never a choice at all. The marks forced onto certain communities, in certain towns, so that difference itself could be seen at a glance. And the quiet, careful ways some people found to hold on to their own dignity, even while wearing exactly what the law had commanded them to wear. We will walk the streets with the officials whose entire job was to stop strangers and inspect their clothing, measuring a sleeve, judging a shade, deciding on the spot whether someone had dressed above their place in the world. We will sit with a wool merchant whose daughter's wedding gown was seized and destroyed over a single length of violet cloth. And we will watch slowly as this entire fragile system of color and control began to crack apart, as plague emptied the fields, as trade routes stretched further than anyone expected, and the old rules simply stopped making sense. If any of this finds something in you, if you find yourself drawn to these forgotten textures of history, I'd love it if you considered subscribing to Dreamy Ages, so more of these quiet corners of the past can find their way to you. Now, let the room settle around you, and let's step back into that world. A world of vats and smoke and rivers stained red, where somewhere, in the cold hours before dawn, a dyer is already awake, working by candlelight, so that someone else far away can be beautiful. Before we speak of kings, we should speak of hands. Not the hands that wore fine color, the hands that made it. Cracked, stained, permanently discolored, in many cases from years of standing in dye vats that never fully washed away. In most medieval towns of any size, there was a dyer's quarter, and you could always find it, even blindfolded, because you could smell it before you saw it. Fermenting woad left standing for days took on a stench that neighbors complained about for centuries in petitions that still survive in old town records. Urine collected specifically for its ammonia content was used to help fix certain dyes to cloth. Entire households kept jars by the door for this purpose, not out of carelessness, but necessity. Rivers near dye works ran strange colors depending on the season. Sometimes blue, sometimes a deep, unsettling red. And the people downstream learned to simply live with it, the way we live with traffic, or weather, or noise from a neighbor's wall. Imagine for a moment a woman we might call Agatha, a dyer's wife in a small cloth town along a river in northern Italy. Not a real recorded name. A composite, instead, of the thousands of women whose lives shaped this trade without ever once appearing in a surviving document. By the time she is 30, her hands carry a permanent bluish gray along the fingertips, a mark that never fully fades, no matter how much she scrubs before market day. Neighbors can look at her hands from across a stall and know exactly what her household does for a living, long before she says a single word. Children in the dyer's quarter grew up recognizing this same visible language from an early age, learning to identify a neighboring family's trade by the particular stain on their hands or the particular smell that clung to their clothes, long before they understood any of the economics or the guild politics that shaped their small, cramped corner of town. She rises before dawn, because the vats cannot wait. Woad, once fermented and activated, has to be used within a narrow window of time. Miss it, and the entire batch, days of labor, precious plant material, no small amount of money, is simply lost. She stirs a vat taller than her own waist, using a long wooden paddle, breathing air that would make a modern visitor gag within minutes. And she does this not for herself. The blue she produces today will likely never touch her own body. It is destined for a merchant's cloak, a guild official's robe, perhaps eventually a noblewoman's gown 3 towns away, passed through the hands of drapers and tailors who will never once think about the woman who stood over a stinking vat at 4 in the morning to make that particular shade of blue exist. This is the first truth beneath the story of medieval color, and it is worth letting it settle before we move on. The people who created beauty were almost never the people permitted to wear it. There is a small, telling detail that survives in several guild records from northern European cloth towns, and it concerns Market Day itself, the one day each week when Agatha's world and the world of her customers actually touched. On Market Day, a dyer's household was permitted to sell finished cloth directly to customers, displaying bolts of blue and gray wool on a trestle table set up in the square. Agatha would stand behind that table for hours, her stained hands folded carefully in front of her, half hidden in the folds of her apron, because a customer inspecting fine blue wool did not necessarily want to be reminded of the vat it had come from. A noblewoman's steward, sent to select cloth for the household, might run his fingers along the fabric, hold it up to the light, ask about the fastness of the color, and never once look directly at the woman selling it to him. This was not unusual cruelty. It was simply how the world had arranged itself. The cloth was worth admiring. The hands that made it were not. And yet Agatha knew something that Stewart did not and could not, because he had never stood over a vat at 4 in the morning. She knew, by smell alone, whether a batch would hold its color through a hard winter or fade by spring. She knew which merchants tried to pass off woad-dyed cloth as the far more expensive true indigo imported from further east, and which of them were, in fact, being honest. Knowledge like this had value that no guild contract ever quite managed to fully capture on paper, and it moved quietly from mother to daughter, alongside the stains themselves, long after the men of the household had signed away the formal rights to teach it to anyone outside their own bloodline. Dyers occupied a strange, uncomfortable social position. Their skill was essential. No fine cloth trade could exist without them, and yet their trade itself was often considered dirty, foul-smelling, faintly disreputable. In some towns, dyers were required by law to live and work outside the main city walls, partly for the smell, partly because certain dyeing processes were considered fire risks. Needed constantly, kept at arm's length, valued and looked down upon in the very same breath. I keep coming back to how familiar that contradiction still feels, even now. The people whose labor makes comfort possible for others are so often the people least permitted to enjoy any of it themselves. Agatha's husband, in our imagined household, understood formulas passed down for generations, guarded almost like family secrets. Certain dye recipes, particular combinations of mordants, the chemical fixatives that made color bind properly to wool or linen, were held closely within guild families. taught only to sons, occasionally to daughters who would marry within the trade. This was not simply craft pride, it was survival. And it was, in its own quiet way, a form of inheritance every bit as deliberate as any noble title, passed hand to hand, vat to vat, through households the wider town rarely thought to honor in the way it honored land or blood, even though its knowledge shaped the visible surface of that entire town's daily life. A guild that controlled a particularly rich, stable red or a particularly deep, true black could charge accordingly, could keep rival towns from easily copying their most valuable colors. Entire regional economies, parts of Flanders, certain Italian cloth towns were built quite literally on color secrets, defended as fiercely as any military technology. Woad itself, the plant behind so much of medieval Europe's blue, traveled a considerable distance before it ever reached a vat like the one Agata stirred each morning. Certain regions of France, particularly around Toulouse and Picardy, developed soil and climate conditions especially suited to growing woad in the quantities a serious dye trade required, and by the height of the medieval cloth industry, entire local economies in those regions had reorganized themselves around its cultivation, harvest, and processing. Merchants moved dried, fermented woad balls. The plant was processed into a kind of stable, transportable cake before it ever reached a dye town, along overland trade routes and river barges, through toll stations where local lords collected fees simply for allowing the cargo to pass, each stop adding a little more to the eventual cost of the finished blue cloth a customer would one day purchase without a second thought. By the time a length of blue wool reached a market stall in a distant town, its price reflected not simply the labor of a dyer like Agatha, but an entire invisible chain of farmers, processors, toll collectors, and cart drivers stretching back across 100 miles or more, none of whom the eventual wearer would ever think about or need to. This is worth noticing because it is easy, from a great distance, to imagine medieval color as a simple matter of local craft, a dyer and a vat and a customer. The reality was an economy in the fullest sense, stretching across regions and borders, moving goods and money and risk along routes that took weeks to travel, all of it converging eventually into a single sleeve, a single hem, a single moment of a stranger glancing at your cloak and deciding instantly who you were. And this leads us to the second layer of tonight's story, the one that moves us out of the dye vat and into the courtroom. Because color was never just a craft. By the height of the medieval period, in much of Europe, color had become something closer to law. The roots of this reach further back than most people realize, deep into the fading memory of the Roman Empire. Roman society had already developed a strict, if informal sense that certain colors belonged to certain ranks. Senators wore a stripe of a particular shade. Imperial purple was, at least in principle, reserved for the emperor and his household alone. When Rome's Western Empire collapsed, its habits of hierarchy did not collapse with it. They lingered in the memory of the church, in the customs of surviving noble families, and eventually resurfaced, sharpened and formalized in the sumptuary laws that spread across medieval towns and kingdoms. The word itself comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expense. At their core, these laws were framed as controls on excessive spending, attempts, at least on paper, to keep households from ruining themselves through vanity and competition. But look closely at what these laws actually regulated, town by town, decade by decade, and a different pattern emerges. They were not really about spending at all. They were about visibility, about making absolutely certain that a wealthy wool merchant's wife, however much silver her husband had earned that year, could never be mistaken, not for one glance, not for 1 second, for a woman of noble blood. Because here is the deeper tension underneath all of this. By the 12th and 13th centuries, something was beginning to happen across much of Europe that unsettled the old noble order profoundly. Trade towns were producing genuinely wealthy families, merchants, wool traders, bankers who often had far more actual money than many minor nobles. Money could buy fine cloth. Money could buy skilled tailors. Money could technically buy the same rich reds and deep blacks that noble households wore. What money could not buy, not legally at least, was the right to wear them. And so, town after town, kingdom after kingdom, began passing detailed laws specifying exactly which colors, which furs, which trims, which fabrics belonged to which rank of person. Not simply gold thread reserved for nobility, though that was often true too. Actual named colors, actual named dyes, assigned by law to specific classes, specific professions, and even specific moral categories of person. What this reveals, I think, is something quite important about how power protects itself when it feels threatened. Not always through violence, not always through open declaration, often through small, precise, almost bureaucratic details. The width of a sleeve trim, the permitted shade of a cloak, the specific dye a merchant's daughter was legally forbidden from wearing to her own wedding. Laws so specific, so oddly detailed, that centuries later they can look almost comic to us, until we remember what they were actually built to do. Consider one especially telling example, drawn from the kind of detailed municipal statute that has survived, in fragments, in several northern Italian town archives. A late 13th century civic code from one such town specifies, across several dense paragraphs, exactly how many buttons a woman's outer gown was permitted to display, depending on her husband's registered guild rank, exactly how wide a border of contrasting color could run along her hem, and exactly which of several named reds a bride was permitted to wear at her own wedding, based not on her own family's wealth, but on her husband's civic standing at the moment of the ceremony. A wealthy woman marrying into a modest household would find herself, on her wedding day of all days, restricted to plainer colors than she had worn comfortably throughout her own unmarried life, her new legal status overriding whatever standing her birth family had once afforded her. Reading through statutes like this now, centuries later, it is tempting to laugh at the sheer obsessive specificity of it all, the buttons, the borders, the precisely named shades. But that specificity is exactly the point. A law this detailed could only have been written by people who took the visual sorting of their society with total, unwavering seriousness, down to the smallest button on the smallest sleeve. They were built to make sure that no matter how much money changed hands, no matter how the economy shifted beneath everyone's feet, one thing would remain instantly, visibly, undeniably clear the moment two strangers passed each other in the street. Who belonged where? And nowhere was this more extreme, more jealously guarded, more soaked in myth and money and blood than in the story of a single color. One so rare, so laborious to produce, so wrapped in imperial obsession, that for over 1,000 years, across two empires, it was treated less like a dye and more like a kind of sacred property. A color that could not simply be bought. A color that in its truest, richest form had to be earned by birth alone. Think for a moment about how strange that idea actually is, once you set it beside the sweater or the socks we began this evening with. We tend to assume that in the deep past, before markets and factories, people simply wore whatever they could make with their own two hands, and that only later, with money and trade, did clothing become a matter of careful, deliberate signaling. But the truth we have been building toward all evening runs almost exactly the other way. Clothing was never more carefully, more anxiously signaled than it was in precisely this world we are about to enter, a world where the wrong shade of cloth could unmake a person's claim to belong in a single glance before a single word had been spoken. That is where we are going next. To understand why one particular shade of purple could make an emperor tremble, we first have to go down to the water, to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, near the ancient city the Greeks called Tyre. There, along rocky coastlines, small sea snails clung to stones beneath the surface. Unremarkable creatures, easy to overlook. Nothing about their dull gray shells suggesting anything valuable at all. And yet, hidden inside a small gland near the snail's body, there was a substance that, once extracted, crushed, and exposed carefully to air and sunlight, produced one of the most stable, most breathtaking colors the ancient and medieval world had ever seen. The process to obtain it was almost absurdly labor-intensive. Historical estimates suggest it could take somewhere in the range of 10 to 12,000 of these small snails, painstakingly gathered, cracked open, and processed, just to produce a single gram of usable dye. The smell during production was, by every surviving account, horrific. A rotting, sulfurous stench so strong that dye works producing this color were kept firmly outside city walls, much like the woad vats we imagined a little earlier tonight. Entire coastal economies grew up around this single, foul-smelling, extraordinarily profitable industry, and the color it produced came to be known across the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world simply as Tyrian purple. What strikes me most about Tyrian purple is not just its cost, though the cost alone was staggering. By some ancient accounts, a pound of the finest Tyrian-dyed wool could cost more than a skilled laborer earned in several years. It is the strange, almost paradoxical relationship between beauty and repulsion sitting at the very heart of the color's story. The dye itself, in its raw form, smelled foul enough to clear a room, and yet, once dried, once woven into fine wool or silk, it became one of the most desired, most politically loaded colors in the ancient world. Proof that value, in the world of color, was never really about pleasantness. It was about scarcity, difficulty, control. There is something here worth pausing on because it tells us a great deal about how humans actually decide what is precious. We rarely prize things simply because they are lovely to look at. We prize them because they are hard to get, because so few people can have them, because possessing them announces, without a single word, that we occupy a rare kind of place in the world. Tyrian purple did exactly that. And it did it so effectively that by the time the Roman Empire had absorbed the eastern Mediterranean world, purple had already become something closer to a piece of imperial property than a simple fashion color. This tradition did not fade when Rome's Western Empire crumbled. Later medieval writers, centuries removed from the empire's height, still occasionally referenced Roman purple as a kind of lost golden standard, a color so pure and so completely mastered by the ancients that even the most skilled medieval dyers openly admitted they could only approximate it, never quite reproduce it in full. It intensified dramatically in the empire that continued in the east, the Byzantine Empire centered in Constantinople, which considered itself quite seriously the direct continuation of Rome. It is here that the story of purple reaches something close to its most extreme form. In the Byzantine imperial court, purple was not simply a color reserved for the emperor's wardrobe. It became bound up, quite literally, with the circumstances of a person's birth. There existed a specific, formal Byzantine term, porphyrogenitus. Born in the purple, this title was reserved for children born to a reigning emperor while he actually held the throne, as opposed to children born before their father's rise to power, or children of usurpers who seized the throne through conspiracy or violence rather than legitimate succession. The distinction mattered enormously in a political culture obsessed with legitimacy, a culture where the throne changed hands through assassination and palace intrigue almost as often as through peaceful inheritance. And the physical origin of the phrase was startlingly literal. Byzantine tradition held that empresses gave birth in a specific chamber within the imperial palace, a room whose walls, according to multiple surviving accounts, were lined or paneled with a deep purple stone, a rich porphyry rock, quarried specifically for its imperial coloring. A child born within those literal purple walls carried a claim to legitimacy that no amount of later wealth, ambition, or military success could fully replicate. You could conquer a throne. You could marry into royalty. You could, with enough gold and enough soldiers, force your way into the imperial seat itself. But you could not retroactively arrange to have been born in that particular room, at that particular moment, to a parent already wearing the crown. The ritual surrounding this birth was, by surviving accounts, extraordinarily controlled. Byzantine court protocol specified who was permitted to be present in the chamber, how the newborn was to be received, and how quickly word of the birth was to be carried to the wider court and, eventually, to the city beyond the palace walls. Bells were rung. Proclamations were read aloud in public squares, specifying not just that a child had been born, but that the child had been born porphyrogenitus in the purple room to a reigning emperor. This distinction was announced separately, deliberately, because the crowds listening understood immediately what it meant for the empire's future, in a way that a simple announcement of birth never could have conveyed on its own. Foreign visitors to Constantinople sometimes recorded their astonishment at the sheer ceremonial weight placed on this single word, porphyrogenitus, describing court officials who could recite, without hesitation, the exact birth circumstances of every living member of the imperial family, as though the fact mattered as much as any treaty or military victory the empire had ever achieved. Consider for a moment what this meant for an emperor who had seized his own throne through less legitimate means, and Byzantine history offers no shortage of such men, generals and courtiers, who rose to power through conspiracy, assassination, or simple military force rather than peaceful inheritance. Such a man might rule for decades. He might govern wisely, expand the empire's borders, fill its treasury, win the loyalty of his soldiers and the respect of foreign courts. And yet he himself could never be Porphyrogenitus. That word would always belong to someone else, perhaps to a rival branch of a deposed dynasty, living quietly, sometimes dangerously, somewhere within or beyond the empire's borders, carrying a claim that no accomplishment of the reigning emperor could ever fully erase. Byzantine history records more than one instance of exactly this tension playing out, with real consequence. A usurper, however successful, however capable, often felt compelled to marry into the old Porphyrogenitus bloodline, specifically to legitimize his own rule, or to have his children at least born within that same purple chamber, so that the next generation might carry the claim he himself could never hold. Power, in other words, could be seized. Legitimacy, at least in its purest, most literal Byzantine form, could only be inherited or borrowed through marriage, one generation at a time. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something about how deeply status can become entangled with the physical facts of birth, even in a society sophisticated enough to understand, on some level, that this entanglement was itself a kind of fiction. Everyone at the Byzantine court knew, presumably, that a stone-lined room could not actually confer wisdom, or virtue, or fitness to rule. And yet the fiction held remarkable power anyway, precisely because everyone had agreed, collectively and repeatedly, to treat it as though it were simply true. Purple, in this context, had become something far stranger and more absolute than mere fashion, a kind of biological proof of legitimacy, a color that quite literally could not be purchased, only inherited through the precise, unrepeatable circumstances of birth itself. What seems most telling to me about all of this is how far a society will go to make status feel natural, almost biological, rather than what it actually is, a set of decisions repeatedly reinforced about who gets to belong at the center of power. By tying purple to the literal circumstances of childbirth, Byzantine court culture created the impression that legitimacy was written into the body itself, rather than constructed, defended, occasionally faked by very determined, very ambitious human beings. And ambitious human beings certainly noticed the power of this particular color, even outside the palace walls. As Byzantine influence and its symbolic weight spread across medieval Europe through trade, diplomacy, and the shared inheritance of Roman tradition, purple carried its imperial reputation with it. European monarchs, popes, and high nobility eagerly adopted the color as a marker of the very highest status. Even as the original Tyrian dye-making knowledge slowly faded from common practice, gradually replaced by other, still expensive but slightly more attainable, purple and violet dyes. And this is where the story moves out of the palace and into something closer to everyday medieval life, into the sumptuary courts, the town councils, the quiet specific laws written to make absolutely certain that this particular color stayed exactly where those in power believed it belonged. Across numerous medieval European kingdoms and city-states, laws explicitly restricted the wearing of purple or certain particularly rich violet and crimson shades associated with it to royalty and the highest ranks of nobility and clergy. The specifics varied from region to region and shifted over the centuries, but the underlying logic remained remarkably consistent. A wealthy commoner might, through sheer financial success, afford access to purple-toned dye. The law existed specifically to make sure that affording it and being legally permitted to wear it were two entirely separate things. The gap between those two things, between what money could buy and what law would permit, created, inevitably, an entire shadow trade of its own. Where genuine purple was unavailable or forbidden, counterfeit versions of it flourished, dyed from cheaper combinations of red and blue pigments, designed to approximate the true color, closely enough to fool an untrained eye at a market stall or a candlelit gathering. Guild records from several cloth towns include specific complaints about dyers selling cloth falsely represented as containing true, expensive purple dye when the fabric had in fact been colored through a far cheaper, double dyeing process layering ordinary red over ordinary blue. The fraud here cut in two directions at once, and both of them tell us something about how seriously this particular color was taken. A buyer deceived into paying premium prices for counterfeit purple had been cheated financially, certainly, and guild courts treated this as a straightforward matter of commercial fraud, subject to fines and occasionally the loss of a dyer's license to trade. But a buyer who wore that counterfeit purple in public, believing it to be genuine, risked something else entirely: the sumptuary fine reserved for anyone caught in a restricted color, regardless of whether they had known, at the moment of purchase, that the cloth was not what it claimed to be. Ignorance in most surviving legal codes was no defense. The law cared only about what was on your back, not what you had been told about it in the shop. This meant that an unlucky buyer could be defrauded and punished for the very same piece of cloth, cheated by one system and penalized by another, with no one along the way taking any responsibility for having created the confusion in the first place. What this reveals, I think, is how completely the value of these colors had become detached from anything resembling their actual cost of production, and attached instead almost entirely to the simple fact of legal restriction itself. Genuine purple was valuable partly because it was difficult to make, but counterfeit purple was dangerous, specifically because it was forbidden, because somewhere a law had decided that this particular visual signal belonged only to certain bodies, and any attempt to borrow that signal, knowingly or not, carried real consequence, a lesson every dyer's apprentice in a city like this one learned early and never quite forgot. Let me walk you into a small, imagined but historically grounded scene, the kind that likely played out in some form in more than one European trading town. Picture a prosperous wool merchant we might call Master Aldrich, a man who has spent 20 years building a respectable, genuinely wealthy household through hard work, careful trade, and no small amount of luck. His daughter is to be married, and Aldrich, proud beyond words of what his family has become, commissions a length of fine violet-toned cloth for her wedding gown. Not true imperial purple, which would be almost unthinkable for him to obtain, but a rich, deep shade close enough to draw immediate attention. Word travels quickly in a town of this size. By the time the cloth arrives from the dyer, a local sumptuary official, a very real kind of civic role that existed across many medieval towns, tasked specifically with inspecting the clothing of residents for violations of local dress codes, has already heard the rumor. The official does not need a trial to act. In many towns, the penalty for a color violation like this could be issued on the spot, often as a direct fine, sometimes accompanied by public confiscation of the offending garment, the cloth itself seized, and in some documented cases, publicly destroyed as a warning to others. Aldrich's daughter would very likely never wear that violet gown at all. The fine alone could represent a significant sum, and in more strictly enforced towns, repeated violations could bring escalating punishment, public humiliation, or damage to a family's civic reputation that lingered far longer than any single fine. What makes a scene like this so quietly devastating, I think, is not the money lost. Real as that would have been, it is the specific, deliberate cruelty of the mechanism itself. Aldrich had done everything the world seemed to promise would earn him status. Years of honest labor, careful saving, genuine financial success, and in the end, a length of dyed wool cloth was enough to remind him, publicly, unmistakably, exactly where the actual boundary of his world still stood. No amount of coin could dissolve that particular kind of sealing. There is a quieter, sadder coda to a story like Aldrich's that rarely makes it into the histories, and it concerns what happened after the fine was paid and the cloth was gone. His daughter's wedding still took place on the appointed day in front of the appointed guests. She wore, instead, a gown of good but unremarkable blue, dyed with woad rather than the violet Aldrich had wanted for her, cut well, sewn carefully, entirely legal. No one at the wedding spoke of the confiscated cloth directly, because that would have been unkind, and because everyone present already knew the story regardless. It had traveled through the town in the way such stories always did, faster than any official proclamation, carried from kitchen to kitchen, stall to stall, until even strangers Aldrich had never met found themselves, without quite meaning to, thinking of him slightly differently than they had a season before. Not as a failure exactly. Aldrich remained a respected, prosperous man, his business undamaged, his standing among fellow merchants largely intact. But there was now a small specific story attached to his name, one that would likely outlive him, retold at other weddings, other market days, whenever the subject of overreaching ambition happened to arise. The man who tried to dress his daughter above her place. This, I think, is the part of the sumptuary system that historians sometimes underweight when they focus purely on the fines and the legal architecture. The law did not simply cost Aldrich money. It cost him a small permanent piece of his story, rewritten slightly by his neighbors, in a direction he had never chosen and could never fully correct. Public shame in a small medieval town did not require a public punishment in the dramatic sense. It required only that everyone knew, and that everyone would go on knowing, for as long as anyone cared to remember. This, I think, is the quiet emotional core running underneath the entire history of sumptuary color law. It speaks to something many of us still recognize in our own lives, even now, stripped of any dye vat or medieval fine. The particular ache of doing everything right. of earning something honestly, and discovering that the world has still quietly already decided where your ceiling is and dressed that decision up as something else entirely. Something about taste or propriety or law, rather than admitting what it really was. Fear. Fear of losing distinction. Purple, in the medieval mind, was never really about the color itself. There is a particularly vivid diplomatic dimension to this story, worth pausing on, because purple's power did not stop at the borders of any single kingdom. When foreign ambassadors traveled between medieval courts, the color of their formal dress was often scrutinized as carefully as any spoken word of the negotiation itself, since a visiting envoy dressed in colors above his actual rank could be read, deliberately or not, as a subtle insult, a claim to standing his home court had not actually granted him. Byzantine envoys traveling to Western European courts were, on occasion, granted special dispensation to wear touches of purple that would have been entirely forbidden to a Western noble of equivalent rank, precisely because their home empire's association with the color was so old, so deeply established, that refusing them the color outright would have been read as a diplomatic slight in itself. This created a strange, delicate calculus for court officials tasked with receiving foreign visitors, weighing not simply the practical question of hospitality, but the far more fraught question of exactly how much color a guest was owed and what refusing or granting that color might communicate about the relationship between two distant thrones. A single sleeve, dyed the wrong shade at the wrong moment, could complicate a negotiation that had taken months to arrange. It was about drawing a line so vivid, so visually unmistakable, that it could be read from across a crowded market square, long before anyone needed to check a person's family name, their father's occupation, or the contents of their purse. But purple, for all its imperial weight, was not the color that touched the largest number of ordinary lives. That distinction belonged to a different shade entirely. One born not from rare Mediterranean snails, guarded by emperors, but from a small, unassuming insect. A color so costly, so widely desired, and so strangely double-edged in its meaning that it could represent both the holiest devotion and the coldest terror, sometimes within the very same week, in the very same town square. You will not need to imagine it from a distance for very much longer. Stay with me, because now we need to step into that world of insects and blood. There is a particular kind of red that does not exist in nature the way you might expect. Not the red of a rose, not the red of blood freshly spilled, a deeper red. Something closer to garnet held up against firelight than anything a modern eye encounters casually in daily life. The kind of red that seems almost to hum with its own quiet intensity the longer you look at it. A red that seems to hold light inside itself rather than simply reflect it. The kind of red that once you have seen it in person, in an old painting or an old vestment kept behind glass, you find yourself thinking about days later, without quite knowing why. For most of the medieval world, this red came from an insect, Hermes vermilio, a small-scale insect that lives on the leaves and bark of a particular species of oak tree found around the Mediterranean. Not a berry, not a root, not a flower, the way you might reasonably assume. An insect, dried, crushed, boiled down into a dye so vivid and so stable that garments colored with it could hold their brilliance for generations, passed down through wills, still admired by descendants who had never once thought to ask where the color actually came from. The harvesting itself was brutal, patient work. Women and children in the regions where the Kermes oak grew would spend early summer mornings picking the tiny insects off the bark by hand, one at a time, filling small baskets over the course of long, bent-backed hours. It took an extraordinary number of insects to produce even a modest quantity of dye. Some estimates place the ratio at roughly 70,000 insects for a single pound of usable pigment. Think about that for a moment. 70,000 small lives, gathered one by one so that a length of cloth could hold a color that would outlast the person who first wore it. The women and children who performed this harvest rarely appear by name in any surviving document, though occasional tax and guild records from Kermes producing regions do list payments made to harvesting households, usually calculated by weight, usually modest, usually collected by the male head of household, even when the actual gathering had been done almost entirely by his wife, his daughters, and whatever children were old enough to sit still and work carefully with their small, quick hands. A single morning's harvest might fill only a small basket, the insects themselves barely larger than a grain of wheat, requiring a patience that made the work particularly suited, in the eyes of the time, to women and children rather than grown men who were more often occupied with heavier field labor elsewhere. This assumption, so casually embedded in how the labor was organized, tells us something worth noticing about how medieval society sorted not just color, but the human effort required to produce it, along lines of gender and age as thoroughly as it sorted finished cloth along lines of rank. The heaviest, most visible, most publicly credited labor belonged to men. The patient, repetitive, physically demanding but socially invisible labor, the kind that actually made the color possible in the first place, belonged disproportionately to women and children whose names the record rarely bothered to keep. Even the tools of this harvest reflected the same quiet hierarchy: small woven baskets and simple picking tools, passed down through families, rarely mentioned in guild inventories because they belonged to a category of labor the guild system itself had never quite bothered to formally recognize as skilled work at all, despite the exacting patience it required. This is the kind of fact that tends to get mentioned quickly, almost as trivia, and then left behind. But I want us to sit with it a little longer than that. Because behind every yard of Kermes red cloth in a medieval cathedral, or a noble's portrait, or a merchant's ledger, there is an unbroken chain of ordinary human labor. Hands in the dirt before sunrise. Backs bent for hours. Baskets carried home, counted, sold for very little, so that somewhere else, someone with no idea any of this happened, could simply put on a red cloak and feel, without asking why, that they looked important. A finished garment dyed properly in Kermes red could cost more than a peasant family earned in an entire year of labor. Not a slight luxury. Not an indulgence. A genuine fortune worn on the shoulders of one person for one occasion, sometimes for one single winter, while the family who had actually gathered the insects that made the dye possible might never in their lives own a single garment dyed to even a fraction of that same depth of color. And because the color was so valuable, the knowledge of how to produce it reliably became one of the most closely guarded trade secrets in medieval and early Renaissance Europe. Let me take you to Venice for a moment, or somewhere very much like it, a wealthy trading city built on water, built on secrecy, built on the careful control of exactly which goods left its borders and in what condition. Picture a dye workshop tucked into a narrow canal-side street, the air thick with the smell of boiling insects and mordant chemicals, a smell so distinctive that neighbors several streets away could sometimes tell which house was dyeing that week. Inside, a master dyer we might call Bernardo, not a documented individual, but a composite drawn from the kind of guild-registered dye masters whose names do appear, fragmentarily, in surviving Venetian and Florentine guild records. Works alone, deliberately alone, at the most sensitive stage of the process. He has apprentices. He trusts some of them with certain steps. But the final combination, the precise sequence of mordants, the exact timing of the boil, the particular acid wash that determines whether the red comes out flat and lifeless or deep and luminous, that he keeps entirely to himself. Guild contracts from this period sometimes included clauses forbidding dye masters from teaching their full technique to anyone outside their immediate family, or from working in a rival city without permission. In some documented cases, cities went further still, restricting skilled dyers from leaving at all, treating their knowledge as something closer to a state resource than a personal skill. This kind of restriction existed for a reason, and the reason had a name in several trading cities of this period, a specific recognized danger that guild officials watched for with real vigilance: the poaching of skilled dyers by rival towns eager to shortcut years of their own experimentation. A rival city, hungry for a particular red or black it could not yet reliably reproduce, might send an agent quietly, discreetly, to a competing town, with instructions to approach a respected dye master and offer him a considerably improved life elsewhere. Better housing, guaranteed contracts, sometimes outright citizenship in a city that would otherwise have taken a foreigner years to earn such standing within. Imagine Bernardo, in the middle of an ordinary week, approached at a tavern by a stranger who buys him a drink, asks careful, seemingly casual questions about his work, and eventually, once enough trust has been quietly built, makes an offer far more generous than anything his own city has ever extended to him. A master dyer in this position faced a genuinely difficult calculation. His knowledge, the thing that made him valuable enough to be approached in the first place, belonged, in the eyes of his own guild and his own city council, at least partly to the city itself, not entirely to him. Leaving without permission could mean the loss of guild privileges for any family members remaining behind, the forfeiture of property, occasionally even formal charges of treason against the city's economic interests, treated with a seriousness that might surprise us today, given how casually we now think about the freedom to simply take a better job elsewhere. Some dyers took the risk anyway, slipping away under cover of a trade journey or a family visit, never to return, their names quietly struck from guild rolls and occasionally cursed, for a generation or two, in the same workshops where they had once been trained. Others stayed, weighing the security of a known life, however constrained, against the uncertain promise of a stranger's offer, and we will never know, in most individual cases, whether that was wisdom or simply fear dressed up as loyalty. What strikes me about this particular corner of dyeing history is how closely it resembles the treatment of any valuable, hard-to-replace expertise across very different periods of history. Knowledge that took a lifetime to build, and that a city or an institution had come to depend upon rarely remained the free property of the person who carried it. The body might belong to the individual, but the skill inside that body, once it became valuable enough, had a way of becoming everyone's business but his own. A master dyer with a reputation for the finest reds might live comfortably, might be courted by wealthy patrons, might even be granted certain civic privileges. But he might also live, in a quiet and constant way, under suspicion, watched, not fully free to travel, not fully free to teach. Because the city that had made him wealthy had also made him valuable in a way that came with its own kind of confinement. What fascinates me here is the strange mirror this creates with the nobility who wore the color. The noble in the red cloak was constrained by law, told exactly what he could and could not wear, watched by sumptuary officials, judged by the shade of his sleeve. The dyer who made that same red was constrained by value, watched by his own guild, restricted in his movements, his knowledge treated as something too important to ever be entirely his own. Two very different kinds of cage, built around the very same color. Bernardo, in our imagined version of this world, has a daughter. And here the story takes the kind of quiet turn that rarely makes it into official history, but almost certainly happened, in some form in countless households like his. She has watched him work since she was old enough to stand at his elbow without getting in the way. She knows the smell of the boil that means the color is close to right, and the different smell that means something has gone wrong. She has never been formally taught the full sequence. Guild custom in most cities restricted the deepest trade secrets to sons, or to sons-in-law who had proven their loyalty through marriage. But knowledge, especially knowledge absorbed over years of quiet watching, does not always respect the boundaries that guild law tries to draw around it. There is no surviving document that tells us her name, or confirms that a woman exactly like her ever stepped forward to finish a batch her father could not complete himself, due to illness or injury or simple bad luck. But there is also nothing in the record that rules it out. And guild histories across several Italian cloth cities do contain scattered, frustratingly brief references to widows continuing their late husbands' dye workshops, sometimes for years, sometimes well enough that the quality of the color never publicly wavered. Which means that somewhere in more than one household like Bernardo's, a color the entire legal and economic system had built around exclusively male hands, was, quietly, also being kept alive by women whose names the guild rolls simply never bothered to record. That is the kind of history that lives underneath the history we are usually told. Not hidden because it was secret. Hidden because no one at the time thought it was worth writing down. Now let us follow the color itself out of the workshop and into the two very different worlds it was about to enter. The first of those worlds is the church. By the later medieval period, red had become deeply associated with the highest ranks of the Catholic clergy, most visibly in the scarlet robes worn by cardinals. The color was not chosen casually. Church tradition explicitly tied scarlet to the symbolism of blood, specifically to a willingness to shed one's own blood in defense of the faith, a solemn and rather severe piece of symbolism for a piece of clothing. A cardinal dressed in true deep scarlet was not simply displaying wealth, though the color's cost certainly did that as well. He was displaying a claim to spiritual seriousness, to sacrifice, to standing close enough to the divine that ordinary rules of modesty and dress no longer quite applied to him. The second world the same red entered was almost the exact opposite. In many medieval and early modern European towns, the public executioner, a figure both necessary and deeply feared, often forced to live at the edge of town, sometimes denied burial in consecrated ground alongside ordinary citizens, was frequently required or expected to wear red as part of his public role. A red hood, a red tunic, sometimes simply a red sash or sleeve, depending on the region and the century. The symbolism here was almost the mirror image of the cardinals. Not sacrifice, but the infliction of death. Not holiness, but the cold official violence of the state, made visible, made unmistakable, so that no one in the crowd could pretend not to know exactly what role this particular man was about to perform. The executioner's red carried a weight beyond the moment of execution itself, following him through the rest of his ordinary life, in ways the cardinal's scarlet never had to follow a churchman. In many towns, the executioner and his family lived under social restrictions that extended well past his working hours, barred from certain trades, sometimes required to live in a specific quarter of town, occasionally forbidden from being buried in the same consecrated ground as the townspeople whose laws he had served. The very red that marked his public function marked him privately as well, a color he could never fully set down, even at his own hearth, even among his own children, who often inherited both his trade and the same quiet social distance from their neighbors that came attached to it. Sit with this for a moment, because I think it is one of the more quietly extraordinary details in the entire history of medieval color. The same red, sometimes produced from the very same batch of Kermes dye, purchased from the very same city's dye workshops, draped over the shoulders of a man performing the church's holiest rites on one side of town, and draped over the shoulders of a man performing the state's most feared punishment on the other. Not two different reds. One red, doing two entirely different kinds of work, depending entirely on whose body it happened to be resting on and what that body was about to do. What this reveals, I think, is something important about the nature of symbolic color more broadly. Color itself carries no fixed, permanent meaning. It is meaning only because a particular society, at a particular moment, has agreed to load it with significance, and that significance can point toward reverence in one context and toward dread in another, without the color itself changing in the slightest. We are not so different now, if you think about it honestly. The particular shade of a uniform can mean safety in one setting and fear in another, depending entirely on the body wearing it and the situation surrounding it. A ring on the correct finger can mean devotion. The same ring on a different hand in a different context can raise a question or a suspicion or a scandal. We still read bodies through small signals, the way medieval towns read them through the color of a sleeve. We have simply stopped noticing that we are doing it. There is one more piece of this story I want to linger on before we move forward, and it concerns the ordinary people caught in between these two extremes, neither cardinal nor executioner, but prosperous enough to want a taste of the color's power for themselves. Merchant families in wealthy trading cities frequently pushed against the legal boundaries placed around red, in the same quiet, persistent way Master Aldrich's household pushed against the boundaries placed around purple. A merchant's wife might not be permitted true scarlet, but she might be permitted a deep madder red, a related but legally distinct and far less costly dye, close enough in appearance from a slight distance to satisfy her own sense of standing while remaining just within the letter of the law. An entire secondary economy grew up around these near colors. Dyes designed, quite deliberately, to sit just beneath the legal threshold of the most restricted shades, giving merchant families a way to display wealth and status without technically breaking sumptuary law. The officials tasked with enforcing these codes were not fooled, not entirely. Surviving town records from several cloth-producing regions include specific complaints about merchants wearing shades that were, in the words of one exasperated official, close enough to the restricted color to cause confusion among honest citizens. Laws were periodically rewritten and tightened in response, specifying not just named colors, but named intensities, named saturations, in an ongoing and slightly absurd arms race between the people trying to display status and the officials trying to contain it. I keep returning to this particular corner of the story because of how deeply human it is. Give people a wall, and some of them will spend considerable time and money finding the narrowest possible gap at the edge of it. Not defiance, exactly. Something quieter than that. A persistent, patient pressing against a boundary that was never really about morality in the first place, no matter how firmly the law dressed itself up as concern over excess and vanity. It was about keeping a hierarchy visible. And hierarchies, it turns out, are remarkably hard to keep perfectly sealed, even with the full weight of civic law behind them. Because wherever there is a boundary drawn around beauty, around status, around the right to be seen a certain way, there will always be people finding the narrow seam at its edge and pressing, quietly, patiently, generation after generation, until the seam begins, ever so slowly, to give. But red and purple, for all their power, were colors people fought to reach. Colors people schemed and saved and stretched the law to obtain. There was another category of color entirely in the medieval world. One that no one fought to wear. One that was never a prize, never an aspiration, never something a wealthy merchant tried to sneak past an inspector. A category of color that was handed down, not earned. Forced, not chosen. Sewn onto a person's clothing, not to elevate them, but to mark them apart from everyone else in the street. And that is where we need to go next, because it is here, in the coldest and least discussed corner of this history, that the true purpose of all these color laws becomes impossible to look away from. Let us step back for a moment before we go further and look plainly at what a sumptuary law actually was. Not the flattering version, not the version that lets us imagine these laws as quaint historical curiosities about hemlines and sleeve widths. The plain version? A sumptuary law was, in its simplest form, a piece of legislation that told a person what they were and were not permitted to put on their own body. No exceptions for taste. No room for personal preference, however modest. Not because of safety. Not because of practicality. Because of rank. These laws covered an extraordinary range of daily life once you start reading them closely. how many courses a household was allowed to serve at a wedding feast, depending on the social standing of the family hosting it, how much fur trim was permitted on a winter cloak, and which specific animal's fur was reserved for which class of person. Ermine and sable kept almost entirely for the highest nobility, while rabbit and cat fur were left for everyone else. How long a woman's train was allowed to trail behind her at a formal occasion, measured, in some surviving town statutes, down to a specific number of inches, and running through nearly all of it, color. Named colors. Named intensities. Assigned by law to specific ranks of person, as though a shade of red or purple were a kind of property that could only be inherited, never simply purchased. We spent our earlier hours tonight with the people straining against the upper edges of this system. The wool merchant reaching for violet, the dye master's household quietly circling the narrow legal gap between madder and true scarlet, ordinary ambition pressing gently against an extraordinary wall. But there is a very different side to this same system, one that involved no reaching upward at all. Because sumptuary law did not only tell people what they could not wear. In certain documented cases across various parts of medieval and early modern Europe, it told certain people exactly what they had to wear. Not a ceiling, a brand. The most widely documented example of this concerns the treatment of Jewish communities in various parts of medieval Europe. Beginning in the 13th century and continuing in various forms across different kingdoms and city-states for centuries afterward, a number of civil and religious authorities issued decrees requiring Jewish residents to wear a distinguishing mark on their clothing. The broader push behind many of these decrees traces back to a church council held in Rome in 1215, where church leaders gathered from across Europe to address a wide range of matters concerning doctrine, discipline, and the governance of Christian society. Among the many decisions reached at that gathering was a directive encouraging distinguishing dress for certain religious minorities living within Christian territories, a directive that individual kingdoms and cities then interpreted, expanded, and enforced in their own particular ways over the following centuries, with considerable variation in strictness from one region to the next and from one century to the next. Some rulers enforced the requirement with real severity for years at a stretch. Others allowed it to lapse into loose, inconsistent practice, revived only occasionally, often when a new ruler or a new council wished to reassert older forms of authority. This inconsistency itself is worth pausing on, because it tells us something about how these requirements actually functioned in practice, beneath their surface appearance of fixed, unbreakable law. A requirement enforced strictly under one ruler might be quietly abandoned under his successor, only to be reinstated, sometimes with harsher penalties, a generation later under a different regime entirely, driven less by any change in underlying belief than by the shifting political needs of whoever happened to hold power at a given moment. Communities living under these requirements learned, out of necessity, to read the political weather of their own moment as carefully as any court advisor, understanding that a period of loose enforcement could end abruptly, without warning, whenever a new authority decided that renewed visibility served its purposes. Elders within these communities often carried, passed down through careful oral memory, a working knowledge of exactly which regions and which periods had historically enforced these requirements most harshly, and which had tended toward leniency, a kind of inherited map of danger and relative safety that shaped where families chose to settle, trade, or travel for generations at a stretch. This uncertainty was, in its own way, a form of control, every bit as effective as consistent enforcement might have been, keeping affected communities in a state of ongoing vigilance that never fully relaxed, even during years when the marking requirement was rarely checked at all. The specific form of this mark varied considerably depending on the time and place. In some regions, it took the shape of a badge, often yellow, sometimes shaped like a circle or a ring, worn visibly on the outer garment. In others, it took the form of a specific style of hat, distinct enough in shape and color to be recognized from a distance. The stated justification, recorded in several surviving ecclesiastical documents from the period, framed these requirements as a matter of preventing what was described as improper mixing between communities of different faiths. Historians examining these justifications alongside the actual social and economic conditions of the period have generally concluded that the stated religious concern, whatever sincerity it carried among individual clergy, coexisted with a far more practical set of motives among civic and royal authorities, who found a visibly marked population considerably easier to tax, monitor, and periodically extort than one that could move through a town unremarked. But look at what the mark actually did in practical daily terms, and the deeper function becomes difficult to avoid. It made a person's identity legible from across a street before a single word was exchanged, before anyone had the chance to be known as an individual rather than a category. It meant a merchant, a physician, a mother walking to market, a father walking his child to a lesson, could be identified, watched, and treated according to a fixed classification, entirely independent of anything about them as a person. This deserves a moment of stillness without rushing past it, because this is, in its coldest and most stripped-down form, exactly what every sumptuary law in this story has been doing, in one direction or another, all along, using cloth and color to make an internal social category impossible to hide, impossible to blur, impossible to escape, even briefly, even in a crowd, even for a single walk across town. The merchant's wife, barred from Violet, was being told, through cloth, that she did not belong at the top. The community forced into a yellow badge was being told, through cloth, that they did not belong inside the circle of full belonging at all. Same mechanism. Radically different and radically crueler purpose. There is a second group whose clothing was similarly regulated by force rather than choice in numerous medieval and early modern towns, and that is women working in the sex trade. Across various European cities, regulations required registered sex workers to wear a specific identifying element of dress. In some regions, a particular colored ribbon or cord. In others, a specific style or color of hood or veil, the details shifting considerably from town to town and century to century. As with the marks imposed on Jewish communities, the stated purpose in surviving civic records was often framed around public order and around allowing ordinary citizens to know at a glance who they were dealing with. But the practical effect was, again, the stripping away of the possibility of being seen as anything other than the category assigned. A woman marked this way could not simply walk to a market or attend a church service or move through a town square as an unremarkable person going about an unremarkable day. Every ordinary errand became, in some small measure, a public performance of a role she had not chosen, watched by neighbors who had long since stopped seeing her as anything beyond the category the mark assigned her. The mark spoke before she did. It spoke instead of her. There is one more dimension of this forced visibility worth naming before we move forward, and it concerns how these markings passed, quietly and inevitably, from one generation to the next. A child born into a community required to wear a particular mark grew up understanding, from the earliest age at which understanding is possible at all, that a piece of cloth or a specific color was not a choice available to them the way it was to other children playing in the same street. This is a different kind of inheritance than the porphyrogenitus birthright we spent time with earlier tonight, but it is an inheritance all the same, a status written onto the body before the body itself had any say in the matter, passed down not through a purple-walled chamber, but through the ordinary, unremarkable fact of which household a child happened to be born into. The enforcement of these particular regulations tended to be uneven, tightening and loosening depending on the priorities of a given town council, or the moral anxieties of a given decade. In much the same way, enforcement of the marks required of Jewish communities rose and fell with the political climate of a given ruler or region. Some towns fined women directly for failing to display the required marking. Others placed the burden of enforcement on brothel keepers, who could themselves be fined if the women working under their roof were found in public without the appropriate sign. This detail matters because it reveals how thoroughly the logic of visible sorting had embedded itself into the machinery of civic administration. It shows a system that had stopped thinking of these markings as an isolated punishment aimed at an individual and had instead built an entire small bureaucracy designed to keep that punishment self-sustaining year after year with almost no ongoing effort required from the authorities who had first imposed it. It was not simply that individual women were punished for stepping outside an assigned visual category. An entire chain of financial responsibility was constructed around making sure that category remained visible at all times, with penalties distributed up and down that chain to ensure everyone involved had an incentive to keep the system functioning smoothly. It's worth pausing here to say something plainly, because it matters. We are not going to spend our time tonight cataloging every regional variation of these markings, or lingering over the specific cruelties involved. That kind of detail does not serve understanding. It only risks turning real human suffering into a kind of historical spectacle, and that is not what this story is for. What matters, instead, is the underlying pattern, because the pattern is the truth this entire episode has been circling from the very beginning. The same visual language that let a noble be recognized as noble on sight, let a persecuted community be recognized as separate on sight, and let a woman in a stigmatized profession be recognized as unrespectable on sight, all in the exact same glance, using the exact same tool. Color did not simply decorate medieval society. It sorted it. Quietly. Constantly. Without needing a single spoken word. And once you see that pattern clearly, it becomes very hard to look at any color law from this period, even the seemingly minor, seemingly petty ones about sleeve width or fur trim, without seeing the same colder machinery humming quietly underneath. But history, even at its coldest, rarely leaves people entirely without agency. And this is where I want to turn now, gently toward the quieter, less documented current running beneath all of this. The current of resistance. Not loud resistance, not rebellion in the dramatic sense we might imagine. Something smaller, something that survives when it survives at all, only in fragments and scattered court records, in the occasional surviving letter or diary entry that happened, by chance, to outlast the centuries. We know, for instance, that enforcement of these forced markings was never as complete or as consistent as the laws themselves suggested. Surviving municipal records from several cities include repeated reissuances of the same decree, sometimes only a few years apart, a pattern that historians studying this period generally read as strong evidence that the original law was simply not being followed with any real consistency and had to be periodically restated, often with harsher penalties attached, in an attempt to force compliance that clearly was not happening on its own. Which tells us something significant. People found ways around it. Not always. Not everywhere. Not without real risk to themselves. But often enough that the authorities kept having to try again. Consider a household we might imagine in a mid-sized city along a well-traveled medieval trade route, a merchant family whose business regularly required travel between towns with different, inconsistently enforced marking requirements. The father of this household, we can reasonably imagine, kept more than one version of his outer garments, one bearing the required mark, worn within the walls of his home city, where enforcement was consistent and the penalties for omission were severe, and another, unmarked, folded carefully into his travel bags for use in towns where the requirement was rarely checked at all, or where a modest bribe to a tired gatekeeper could resolve any question before it became a formal problem. This was not defiance in any dramatic sense. It was closer to a kind of exhausting fluency, a constant situational awareness of exactly which version of himself he was legally required to display in any given place, adjusted and readjusted as he crossed from one jurisdiction into the next, sometimes several times within a single week of travel. Some accounts describe communities negotiating collectively with local rulers for exemptions or for permission to pay a fee instead of complying with a marking requirement, effectively purchasing a small temporary space of ordinary visibility. Others describe individuals simply removing a badge once outside a supervised area and replacing it before returning, a small, constant, exhausting act of risk management that we can only imagine the toll of, repeated day after day for an entire lifetime. And there is something else worth noticing, something quieter still, in the historical record. Within communities forced into a particular marking, that same marking sometimes became something else entirely, over time, inside the community itself. Not chosen. Never that. But held. Worn not as the outside world intended it to be read, but as a private internal signal of belonging to one another. A shared visual language of survival, passed silently between people who understood exactly what it meant to walk through a hostile street wearing a color they had never been permitted to choose. This is not a triumphant story, and I don't want to pretend that it is. There was no clever trick that undid the cruelty of these laws. No secret code that transformed suffering into simple defiance. What there was, instead, was something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. The stubborn, unglamorous persistence of ordinary human dignity, continuing to exist, continuing to find small forms of connection and meaning, even inside a system deliberately built to strip it away. What keeps pulling me back whenever I return to this part of the story is how universal this particular ache actually is, stripped of its medieval costume. The experience of being reduced on sight to a single visible category, of having other people decide before you have said a word exactly who you are and what you deserve, of carrying a mark, visible or not, a color, a name, a label, an assumption that was never yours to choose, and yet somehow becomes the first and sometimes only thing anyone sees. Most of us, at some point in our own lives, have felt some quieter version of this. Being sorted before being known. Being read as a category before being read as a person. It is, I think, one of the oldest and most persistent human wounds, and the medieval color laws simply gave it an unusually literal, unusually visible form. There was a third category of forced marking in medieval Europe, worth mentioning briefly, because it extends the same pattern into territory that had nothing to do with rank, or faith, or profession at all, and everything to do with illness. In numerous regions, individuals afflicted with leprosy were required, by both custom and in many places formal law, to identify themselves publicly, sometimes through distinctive clothing, sometimes through a bell or clapper carried and sounded while walking, warning others of their approach before they came close enough to be seen clearly. The stated purpose here was different from the purposes behind the other marks we have discussed tonight, rooted in a genuine, if often misdirected, fear of contagion rather than in any claim about rank or belonging. But the mechanism was, once again, identical. A visible signal attached to a body that announced a category before the person inside that category had any chance to be encountered as anything else. What connects all three of these markings, the badge, the ribbon, the bell, is not that they shared a single motive, because they plainly did not. It is that medieval society, again and again, reached for the same basic tool whenever it wanted a category to be instantly, unmistakably legible in public space. Cloth, sound, and color doing the work that a modern bureaucracy might now do through paperwork, databases, and identification cards. The tool changes. The impulse, it seems, does not. Cloth and dye instead of assumption and glance. But the underlying ache, the ache of being seen only as what you were assigned to be, rather than who you actually are, that part, I suspect, has never really changed at all. We have spent this hour in the coldest room of tonight's story, and I want to be honest with you about that, rather than smoothing it over on the way out. But even here, even in this room, something in this history keeps insisting on being human. The daughter who may have quietly kept her father's dye secrets alive. The community that turned a forced badge into a private signal of belonging. The small, constant, exhausting acts of people refusing, in whatever quiet way was available to them, to be only what the law had decided they were. That refusal is where we are going to spend some real time next, because it deserves more than a passing mention. But for now, let this room settle around you a little longer. Let the weight of what we've walked through tonight rest, without needing to be resolved all at once. There is still more of this story ahead of us. The officials who patrolled the streets watching for violations, the strange reversal of black from the color of penance to the color of the highest fashion, and the slow, uneven collapse of this entire system of color and control. But that is a story for the next part of our night together. For now, simply rest here, in the quiet, with everything we have uncovered so far settling gently into place. Every system of rules needs someone willing to enforce them in the street on an ordinary afternoon against an ordinary neighbor. And medieval sumptuary law was no exception. In town after town across Europe, civic authorities appointed officials whose entire job was to walk the streets, watch the crowds, and identify violations of the dress code in real time on site. Not a metaphorical role, an actual paid position recorded in municipal account books alongside the wages of tax collectors and night watchmen. The specifics of the role varied by region and by century. In some cities, this duty fell to existing guild inspectors, already responsible for checking the quality of cloth being sold, who simply had their responsibilities expanded to include checking who was wearing it. The people who took on this role occupied their own strange, uncomfortable position within the town's social fabric, not unlike the dyers we spent time with earlier tonight. A sumptuary officer needed the trust of the civic council that employed him, a sharp enough eye to distinguish subtle variations in dye quality at a glance, and a willingness to confront his own neighbors, sometimes his own relatives, over matters that could feel, to the person being fined, deeply personal rather than merely administrative. Surviving records suggest this was rarely a comfortable job, and several towns found it necessary to rotate the position periodically, or to bring in officials from a neighboring district entirely, on the theory that a stranger might enforce the code more evenly than someone who would still need to buy bread from the very household he had just fined. A handful of surviving petitions even show officials themselves requesting reassignment after only a season or two in the role, citing, in the careful language of civic correspondence, the strain of enforcing a code that placed them permanently at odds with people they had known their entire lives. In others, dedicated sumptuary officers were appointed specifically for this purpose, sometimes granted the authority to stop a person in the street, examine their clothing closely, and issue an on-the-spot fine. Picture the strangeness of this for a moment. A stranger, backed by the full authority of civic law, stopping you mid-errand, lifting the hem of your sleeve between two fingers, studying the exact shade of your cloak against the afternoon light, deciding, often within a matter of seconds, whether the color you were wearing matched the rank you were legally permitted to claim. Surviving court records from several cloth-producing towns give us small, specific glimpses of how this actually played out. A woman fined for a fur trim, judged too fine for her household's registered status. A merchant cited for a cloak dyed a shade the record describes only as too near to the forbidden crimson. A tailor summoned to testify about which specific dye he had used on a client's gown because the client's rank was in dispute and the color itself had become, quite literally, evidence in a civic proceeding. Let me draw one such encounter out a little further, the way it might actually have unfolded on an ordinary Tuesday in a mid-sized cloth town. A woman we might call Elise, the wife of a moderately successful glover, has come to the market square wearing a cloak she had recut and readied herself from an older garment, adding a deeper red band along the hem to freshen its appearance for the coming season. She has not consulted a dyer about the legality of the shade. She has simply used what dye she had at home, mixed a little stronger than usual, without giving the matter a second thought. The town's sumptuary officer, a man whose name appears in surviving accounts only as a line item, so many shillings paid for his services that quarter, stops her near the fish stalls, asks her to hold out the hem, and studies it in the gray daylight for a long moment before speaking. He does not accuse her of anything. He simply asks where the cloak was dyed, and by whom, and Elise, flustered, admits she did the work herself, at home, with dye purchased from a peddler the previous autumn. This admission oddly makes things worse rather than better. A shade this close to the restricted crimson, produced by an untrained hand, rather than a licensed guild dyer, cannot be easily verified as accidental rather than deliberate, and the officer, following procedure, records the violation and issues a fine. Elise pays it from the household's savings, quietly, without telling her husband exactly how much it cost, and unpicks the offending hem herself that same evening, replacing it with a plainer, undyed strip of wool. Nothing about this story is dramatic. No one was imprisoned. No family fortune was lost. And that, in a way, is exactly the point. The sumptuary system did not need dramatic punishments to do its work. It needed only this: thousands of small, unremarkable, slightly humiliating corrections, repeated across thousands of ordinary households, each one a quiet reminder of exactly where the boundary sat, reinforced not through spectacle, but through the sheer, grinding accumulation of everyday enforcement. What stands out to me about these records is how seriously everyone involved seemed to take them. Not as a minor administrative nuisance, as something closer to a genuine breach of public order. Because in a world without photographs, without printed identification, without any of the documentation we now take for granted, clothing was doing an enormous amount of quiet, constant work. It was standing in for a birth certificate, for a bank statement, for an entire social history that a stranger on the street had no other way of knowing. Disrupt that visual language even slightly, even by a single shade of forbidden red, and you were not simply breaking a rule about fashion. You were introducing a small crack of confusion into the entire visible order of the town. That, I think, is the real reason these laws were enforced with such surprising seriousness. Fines issued, cloth confiscated, repeat offenders publicly named. It was never really about the fabric. It was about keeping the whole legible system of the town intact. But even the most careful system of color law eventually runs into a color that refuses to sit still and behave the way the law expects it to. And in the history of medieval and early modern Europe, no color demonstrates this quite so vividly as black. For much of the earlier medieval period, black held a very particular, very modest place in the color hierarchy. It was, in many contexts, the color of penance, of mourning, of humility, deliberately chosen by those who wished to signal restraint rather than display. Monastic orders favored plain black or undyed wool as a visible rejection of worldly vanity. Widows wore black in various regions as a marker of grief and withdrawal from ordinary social display. And practically speaking, a truly deep, rich black was, for a very long time, surprisingly difficult and unreliable to produce. Cheap black dyes existed, made from readily available materials like walnut husks or iron-rich mud. A household too poor to afford proper dye at all often relied on these cheaper methods for whatever black clothing occasion required. A mourning garment or a modest formal cloak, fully aware that the color would not hold, and simply accepting the fading as an ordinary, unremarkable cost of an ordinary life. But these produced a black that faded quickly, often shifting toward a dull, uneven brown or gray after only a handful of washes. A garment that looked convincingly black on the day it was dyed might, within a season, look simply tired. This made a truly stable, deep, luxurious black extremely difficult to achieve, and therefore, once the technique improved, extremely expensive. Achieving a genuinely rich black required, in most cases, a layered process entirely different from producing a single clean color. A skilled dyer would first saturate the wool or silk in a deep blue, typically from woad or true indigo, building a dense base layer of color into the fibers themselves. Only then would the cloth be red-dyed again, this time in a strong red or reddish brown, derived from madder or gallnuts, the second color settling over and interacting with the first to produce a black with real depth, a black that seemed to hold shadow within it rather than simply sitting flat on the surface of the cloth. This double dyeing process consumed twice the raw material, twice the labor, twice the time of an ordinary single-color batch, and the result, done well, was almost unrecognizable next to the thin brownish black produced by cheaper walnut or iron dyes. Understanding this helps explain why the Burgundian court's embrace of black was not, in fact, a rejection of luxury at all, however austere the color might look to modern eyes accustomed to associating black with restraint. A member of Philip's court, dressed head to toe in this deep, true black, was displaying a garment that had consumed as much skilled labor and costly material as any brightly colored equivalent, if not considerably more, while presenting an outward appearance of severe, controlled elegance that many observers found even more impressive than open, obvious extravagance. It was luxury wearing the mask of restraint, and that particular combination, once established, proved almost impossible to resist for anyone in a position to afford it. The fashion spread outward from the Burgundian court in a pattern worth tracing for a moment, because it shows how quickly a single influential court's preference could ripple across an entire continent's visual language. Diplomats and visiting nobles who witnessed the Burgundian court firsthand carried word of it home to their own territories, and portrait painters, always eager to flatter their wealthy patrons with the most current and impressive fashions, began depicting their own subjects in the same deep, expensive black, whether or not those subjects had ever actually traveled to Burgundy themselves. Within 2 or 3 generations, this single court's aesthetic preference had reshaped formal portraiture across much of Western Europe, so thoroughly that many of us, looking at paintings from this later period today, assume black was simply the natural, timeless color of solemn formality, without ever suspecting that it had once been, quite deliberately, the color of poverty and penance, before a handful of ambitious dyers and one fashion-conscious duke rewrote its meaning entirely. And this is exactly where the story of black takes its extraordinary turn. By the 15th century, in the court of the Duke of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest and most fashion-conscious courts in all of Europe at the time, black underwent a complete transformation in meaning. Philip the Good, ruling over an extraordinarily prosperous Burgundian territory, began favoring deep, richly dyed black in his own court dress, along with his closest nobles, not as an expression of humility, as an expression of exactly the opposite. The specific black favored by the Burgundian court required an elaborate multi-stage dyeing process, often involving an expensive base dye beneath the black to achieve the necessary depth and richness, meaning that a truly excellent black garment could cost considerably more than an ordinary colored one. Almost overnight, in fashion terms, black transformed from the color of the penitent and the poor into one of the most exclusive, most sought-after colors in European high fashion. There is something almost wonderful about this particular turn in the story, and what it reveals about the actual mechanics of status and color, stripped bare of any pretense about virtue or humility. Black had not changed. The dye chemistry required to produce a truly excellent black had simply improved to the point where achieving it became, once again, a mark of extraordinary resource and skill. And the moment scarcity returned to a color, so did its power. The meaning was never really inherent in the color itself. It was inherent in how hard the color was to get, and who therefore could afford to have it. Give any color enough difficulty, enough labor, enough cost, and eventually it will climb the social ladder, no matter how humbly it began. This fashion for rich, formal black spread outward from Burgundy, across much of European nobility in the following century, eventually becoming closely associated with the restrained, severe elegance of Spanish court fashion under the Habsburgs, whose black-clad formal portraits are still instantly recognizable centuries later. The same color that had once marked a monk's vow of poverty now marked some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in Europe. Not through irony, through the simple, quiet, endlessly repeating logic of scarcity and control that is run underneath this entire story from the very first hour we spent together tonight. Now, let us turn to a quieter corner of this history, one that involves neither officials nor dukes, but ordinary women navigating a set of rules they had no part in writing. Because for every law specifying exactly what a woman of a given rank could or could not wear, there existed in the same households the same quiet ingenuity we have already glimpsed in Bernardo's imagined daughter, watching her father's dye vats. Sumptuary law, in most regions, focused overwhelmingly on the most visible, most immediately legible parts of an outfit. The color of an outer cloak, the shade of a formal gown, the trim visible at a sleeve or a collar, easily assessed from across a room or a street. What these laws paid considerably less attention to in most surviving codes was what lay beneath or close against the body or tucked out of immediate public view. And so, across many households, women found a quiet, technically compliant workaround. A gown might be cut on the outside from a modest, legally permitted wool, dyed a shade well within a woman's registered rank. The seamstresses who executed this kind of quiet substitution deserve their own small mention here, since it was very often their skilled, deliberate hands, rather than the woman who would eventually wear the finished gown, that first identified exactly where a legal garment's construction could accommodate a hidden, illegal flourish without altering its outward appearance in the slightest. But its lining, visible only in careful glimpses, when a sleeve turned back or a hem lifted slightly while walking, might be cut from a far richer, far more restricted color entirely. A flash of forbidden crimson, visible only in motion, only to those paying close attention, gone again the moment the fabric settled. Embroidery offered another quiet avenue. Sumptuary laws frequently specified restrictions on the base color and quality of a garment's primary fabric, while saying comparatively little about the color of embroidery thread used to decorate it. A woman working within a legally modest gray or brown wool gown might embroider its edges, its cuffs, its collar, with threads dyed in colors technically forbidden to her rank if used as a primary fabric, but seemingly overlooked, or at least far less rigorously enforced when confined to decorative stitching. Jewelry and small accessories offered a third avenue, one that historians studying surviving portraits and inventories from this period have noted again and again. A woman restricted from wearing a certain shade of cloth might still wear a ribbon, a belt, a small cap or veil trim in exactly that forbidden color, items small enough and specific enough in their function that they frequently escaped the notice of officials primarily trained to assess the color of a primary garment. None of this was rebellion exactly, in any dramatic sense. Consider a woman we might call Margrethe, the wife of a moderately successful cloth merchant in a Flemish trading town, whose household was registered at a rank permitting only modest, muted colors as primary garments. Margrethe owned exactly one gown lined, along its inner sleeves and hem, with a deep crimson silk imported at considerable cost through her husband's trading contacts, a lining visible only when she raised her arm to reach for something, or when she climbed a set of stairs and her skirt lifted briefly from the ground. She wore this gown to church every week for years, the crimson flashing and vanishing, in a way that no sumptuary officer ever once recorded as a violation, because no sumptuary officer ever managed to catch more than a passing glimpse of it. Her neighbors, we can reasonably assume, noticed anyway, the way people in small communities always notice such things, and said nothing, partly out of politeness, partly perhaps because more than one of them owned a similarly quiet indulgence of their own, tucked into a hem or a collar, where the law's attention rarely reached. No woman doing this was attempting to overturn the system that constrained her, but it was something quietly persistent. A continuous patient negotiation with a set of rules that had never once consulted her, conducted almost entirely through small, deniable, technically defensible choices. A lining here, a thread there, a ribbon that could always, if questioned, be explained away as a small personal indulgence rather than a genuine violation. What moves me about this particular thread of the story is how much quiet intelligence it required. These were not careless choices. They were the product of women who had studied the exact wording and enforcement patterns of laws they had no voice in writing, and who had found, through patient observation, precisely where those laws grew thin, where the letter of the rule stopped, and where a small private freedom could still be claimed. This is, I think, one of the oldest and most persistent patterns in human history, far beyond the specific question of medieval color. Wherever a rule is written to control what a person may display outwardly, some quieter form of self-expression tends to migrate inward, or downward, or backward, into the folds and linings and small hidden corners the rule makers never quite thought to specify. Control the cloak, and the lining becomes the place where a person is still, quietly, allowed to be fully themselves. By the closing years of the medieval period, This entire intricate system, the officials, the fines, the confiscated cloth, the careful hierarchy of purple and crimson and forbidden black, the small hidden linings and embroidered edges where ordinary people quietly claimed a sliver of color for themselves, was still standing, still enforced, still very much a part of daily life across much of Europe. But it was standing on ground that was about to shift beneath it, more suddenly and more completely than anyone enforcing these laws could have anticipated. Because a catastrophe was coming that had nothing at all to do with fashion, and everything to do with who exactly would still be alive to enforce these careful distinctions once it had passed. But to understand that, we need to go deeper into the years the plague actually left behind. In the autumn of 1347, ships began arriving at Mediterranean ports carrying something far more consequential than any cargo of dye or cloth. Within a few short years, the plague that would come to be known as the Black Death had swept across nearly the entire continent, killing, by most historical estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Europe. Whole villages emptied. Entire workshops fell silent, their masters and apprentices alike gone within the same terrible season. And in the strange, disordered world that followed, something began happening to the careful color hierarchies we have spent this evening exploring. They started, slowly and then quite rapidly, to fall apart. Not because anyone repealed the laws. Most sumptuary codes remained technically on the books for generations after the plague had passed. But because the world the laws had been built to describe simply no longer existed in the same form. With so much of the labor force gone, surviving workers, for the first time in generations, found themselves in a position of genuine leverage. Peasants who had once been tied to a single manor, expected to accept whatever wage or condition their lord offered, could now, quite simply, walk to the next village and demand better terms, because labor itself had become desperately scarce. Wages rose, sharply, and in many regions permanently. Consider a family we might imagine in the English countryside a decade or so after the plague had passed through their region, a family that had lost an uncle and 2 cousins to the sickness, but survived largely intact themselves, and found in the strange arithmetic of a depopulated countryside that their own labor was suddenly worth considerably more than it had been in their parents' generation. The father, a tenant farmer who had once worked land under obligations so restrictive he could barely leave his own village without permission, discovered that a neighboring manor, desperate for workers to bring in its harvest, was offering wages no lord would have dreamed of paying a generation earlier. Within a few years, this family had saved enough to purchase, for the first time in their household's memory, a length of genuinely good dyed wool cloth, rather than the plain undyed homespun that had clothed them for generations. The eldest daughter wore a portion of it to a village feast, a deep, warm brown dyed with proper madder, rather than the cheap, uneven bark dyes her mother had always used. And for one evening, in one small village, she looked, by the visual standards of the world around her, considerably more prosperous than her family's actual standing would have permitted only 20 years before. No sumptuary officer stopped her, partly because the color she wore, however improved, still sat well within what the letter of the law permitted for a family of her rank. But partly, too, because the entire machinery of enforcement was itself strained past its old capacity, its officials fewer, its priorities elsewhere, its careful old certainties about who belonged where, no longer quite matching the visibly changing world in front of it. This new money did exactly what money in this story has always done. It went looking for color, the way it always had, in every century this story has touched so far tonight. Surviving court records from the decades following the plague show a marked increase in prosecutions for sumptuary violations, a detail that historians studying this period generally read not as evidence that people had suddenly become more disobedient, but as evidence that far more people, for the very first time, actually had the means to attempt a violation at all. The wall was still there, but for the first time in centuries, a genuinely large number of people had enough coin in their pocket to press against it. And a wall pressed against by many hands, again and again, across generations, eventually begins to show its cracks. Several regions responded by tightening their sumptuary codes even further in the years immediately following the plague, adding new restrictions, raising fines, attempting to hold the old order together through sheer legal force. But the underlying economic reality had shifted too fundamentally for the old rules to hold indefinitely. Nobility itself was changing. Old noble families, some of whom had lost significant portions of their own wealth and even their own bloodlines to the plague, increasingly found themselves depending on marriages, loans, and business partnerships with the very merchant families the old color laws had been designed to keep visually separate from them. A noble house facing this kind of quiet financial pressure often discovered, sometimes within a single generation, that pride in an old bloodline mattered a great deal less at the moment a debt came due than the simple, practical question of which family in town actually held enough coin to settle it. It becomes very difficult to enforce a rule that says a wool merchant's daughter may never wear violet, when that same merchant's family has just loaned your household the money required to keep your ancestral estate from being sold. Consider how differently a scene like Aldrich's from earlier tonight might have played out only a century later in this changed world. A prosperous merchant family, having spent 2 generations quietly accumulating both wealth and marriage connections into minor noble houses, might find that its daughters were no longer merely tolerated at noble gatherings, but actively courted as marriage prospects, their family's coin considered worth considerably more than an old title's fading prestige. Sumptuary officials in towns experiencing this shift found themselves in an increasingly awkward position, expected to enforce codes that no longer matched the actual social reality unfolding in front of them, finding a merchant's wife for a shade of red one week while attending, the very next week, a wedding celebration at which half the noble guests owed that same family a considerable debt. Status and money, which the old system had worked so hard to keep visually distinct, were becoming, in practice, increasingly difficult to tell apart. And then, into this already shifting world, arrived something that would change the story of color permanently. In the closing years of the 15th century, European ships began returning from the newly encountered lands across the Atlantic, carrying, among many other things, an entirely new source of red dye, cochineal. Produced, much like kermes, from a small insect, this one native to Central America, harvested from cactus plants by indigenous producers whose sophisticated dye-making traditions long predated European contact. Cochineal produced a red of extraordinary brilliance and stability, in many respects even more vivid than the kermes red that had shaped so much of this evening's story. Imagine a dye master in Seville, sometime in the early 16th century, opening a shipment crate that has just arrived from across the ocean and finding inside it not cloth, not spices, but small, dried, grayish granules that mean almost nothing to the eye until they are crushed and set into water. He has heard rumors of this new red for months, carried back by sailors and merchants who struggled, in their own accounts, to describe a color that outdid even the finest kermes they had ever produced. He tests a small batch that same afternoon, grinding the dried insects carefully, following a process not so different from the one his own family had used with kermes for generations, and watches the water in front of him turn a red so saturated, so immediately alive, that for a long moment he simply stands there, staring into the basin, forgetting to write down the proportions he has just used. Word of a color like this does not stay contained for long. Within a matter of decades, cochineal had become one of the most valuable commodities crossing the Atlantic in either direction, prized by dyers across Europe, precisely because it offered something the old kermes trade never quite could, a genuinely reliable, high-volume source of the deep, brilliant red that had once been rationed out so carefully, guarded so jealously, fought over by guilds and city councils for centuries. Spanish crown records from this period list cochineal, alongside silver, among the most valuable cargo categories arriving from its territories in the Americas, a striking testament to how quickly a color once produced, only in small Mediterranean workshops, had become a matter of genuine state economic importance. And, crucially, it could eventually be produced and traded in far larger quantities than the old Mediterranean kermes supply had ever allowed. The arrival of cochineal did not happen gently or innocently. It came bound up with the immense violence and exploitation of European colonization and the labor that sustained its production, both before and after European contact, deserves to be remembered honestly rather than smoothed into a simple footnote about fashion history. Indigenous producers in the region that is now Mexico had cultivated and refined cochineal production for generations before European ships ever arrived, developing careful methods of tending the cactus plants the insects lived on and harvesting the insects themselves at exactly the right stage of their brief life cycle to maximize the dye's strength. Once colonial rule was established, this existing knowledge and labor was redirected, under increasingly coercive systems, toward feeding European demand, with the profits flowing overwhelmingly toward colonial administrators and European trading houses, rather than toward the communities whose generations of accumulated skill had made the entire enterprise possible in the first place. This is a pattern that should sound familiar by now, if you have been with me through the rest of tonight's story. The hands that produce a color and the hands that profit from wearing it have rarely in this history belonged to the same people. Agata's stained fingers, Bernardo's guarded formulas, and now an ocean away, an entire indigenous industry whose knowledge would eventually help redraw the color hierarchies of an empire that had conquered the very people who made that knowledge possible. But its economic effect on Europe's old color hierarchy was undeniable. A flood of new, high-quality red dye began moving through European markets, gradually loosening the extraordinary scarcity that had once made true rich red a marker of only the very highest rank. Slowly, unevenly, over the course of generations rather than years, the old absolute scarcity that had defined purple and red and eventually even black began to soften. Dyers who had once guarded a single closely held formula as the foundation of an entire family's livelihood now found themselves competing in a marketplace crowded with alternatives, some cheaper, some more vivid, arriving from ports their grandparents could never have located on a map, and the quiet, jealous secrecy that had defined guilds like Bernardo's slowly lost much of its old economic purpose. New dyes arrived from new places. Trade routes stretched further than they ever had before. And the tight, centuries-old link between a specific color and a specific inherited rank began, gradually, to come undone, not through any single dramatic law or declaration, but through the slow, patient erosion of the very scarcity the entire system had always depended on. By the time we reached the later centuries of this story, sumptuary laws regulating color had largely faded from active enforcement across most of Europe, even in places where they technically remained written into old civic codes, gathering dust in municipal archives, increasingly ignored, increasingly unenforceable in a world where color itself had simply become too abundant, too widely available, to function any longer as a reliable marker of who belonged where. Some towns eventually acknowledged this shift formally, rather than simply allowing the old codes to fade through quiet neglect. Municipal records from a number of cloth-producing regions show councils, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, gradually revising their sumptuary statutes to focus less on color itself and more on other, still controllable markers of status. The quality of a fabric's weave, the presence of imported silk versus domestic wool, the number of guests permitted at a wedding feast. Color, the very foundation this entire system had once been built upon, was quietly allowed to slip out of the law's grasp first, before any of these other categories followed it. There is something fitting, I think, in the fact that color was the first thread of this system to unravel. It had always been the most visible, the most immediately legible marker, and precisely because of that, it was also the marker most exposed to the pressures of a changing economy, the first place where increased trade, increased wealth, and increased mobility would inevitably show themselves. A sleeve trim could be measured and regulated with some precision. A shade of red, once dozens of new dyes were flooding in from new corners of the world, each slightly different from the last, each impossible to fully categorize under century-old legal language, simply became too slippery a thing for any law to hold on to for very much longer. The wall did not fall all at once. It simply, slowly, stopped being able to hold anyone back. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's long journey. We began in a bedroom with an ordinary sweater and an ordinary pair of socks, and the quiet observation that choosing a color for us costs nothing at all beyond a moment's preference. We have spent these hours together discovering exactly how recent, how hard-won, how strange that simple freedom actually is. Let us walk back through it all once more, slowly, the way you might walk back through a house before turning off the last light. We walked beside a dyer's wife with permanently stained hands, making a blue she would never be allowed to wear herself. We stood in a Byzantine birthing chamber lined with imperial stone, watching legitimacy itself become a matter of literal, physical color. We sat with a wool merchant whose daughter's wedding gown was seized over a single forbidden shade of violet, and felt the particular ache of a ceiling that no amount of honest labor could ever quite dissolve. We followed a red dye made from 70,000 crushed insects into a cardinal's vestments on one side of a town and an executioner's hood on the other, and watched the very same color mean devotion in one doorway and dread in the next. We looked plainly and without flinching at the coldest use of this entire system. Colors and markings forced onto people rather than chosen by them, a visual language of exclusion rather than status. And we found, even there in that colder room, small and stubborn traces of human dignity refusing to fully disappear. We watched black transform across centuries from the color of penance into the color of the most exclusive court in Europe, learning in the process that meaning was never truly inside the color itself, only in how hard it was to obtain, and who, therefore, was permitted to have it. And we watched the whole intricate system, slowly, unevenly, begin to come apart, not through some grand act of liberation, but through plague and trade and the simple, patient pressure of ordinary people wanting, generation after generation, a little more room to be seen the way they wish to be seen. If there is one thread running beneath every single one of these rooms we have walked through tonight, I think it is this. Somewhere behind every color law we have discussed, there was a person standing very still while someone else decided, on sight, who they were allowed to be. The merchant's daughter waiting to see whether her gown would pass inspection. The dyer's wife watching a noble steward admire cloth without once looking at her hands. The child born, or not born, within a particular purple room. The man or woman required to wear a mark they had never chosen, walking a familiar street that had overnight become somewhere they had to think carefully about how to move through it. Each of them lived inside a world where a glance, a single unspoken glance, could decide more about their day, their marriage, their safety, their standing than almost anything they might have said aloud. That is the world this entire evening has been quietly circling. One dye vat, one courtroom, one forbidden hemline at a time. What this story reveals, I think more than anything else, is something essential about the nature of status itself, in any century, in any society, including our own. Status has never really lived in the object. Not in the purple, not in the crimson, not in the deep, rich black that Burgundian nobles once prized above almost anything else. It lives in scarcity, in difficulty, in the careful, constant work of making sure that some things remain just out of reach for most people, so that reaching them, for the few who can, still means something. We tend to imagine our own world as having moved far beyond all of this, and in some very real ways we have. You will not be fined for the color of your sweater tomorrow morning. No official will stop you in the street to examine the shade of your sleeve. But if you think for just a moment about the quiet ways we still read each other on sight, through what we wear, through what we carry, through the small visible signals we still, almost without noticing, use to sort each other into categories before a single word is exchanged. Perhaps this history is not quite as distant as it first appears. Perhaps it never fully leaves us. We have, in our own century, simply traded cloth and dye for other materials entirely. The cut of a jacket, the brand stitched into a collar, the particular way a person carries themselves into a room, all of it still doing some quiet portion of the work that a length of forbidden violet once did for Aldrich's daughter, or that a badge once did for the communities forced to wear it. We would like to believe we have moved entirely past the habit of reading a person before we know them. The honest answer, I suspect, is that we have only changed the alphabet. Perhaps it simply changes its fabric and its dye and waits quietly for us to notice it again. Thank you for spending this long, slow night with me, walking through vats and courtrooms, and palace chambers and quiet linings, sewn with a color no one was ever supposed to see. If tonight's journey found something in you, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing to Dreamy Ages and leaving a comment about which part of tonight's story stayed with you longest. It helps more than you know, and it means we get to keep opening doors like this one together. There are so many more hidden corners of history waiting for us. More quiet rooms, more overlooked lives, more small, human truths tucked away behind the version of the past we thought we already knew. I'll be here whenever you're ready for the next one. For now, though, let all of this settle. Let the vats and the courtrooms and the palace stone grow soft and distant in your mind, the way a dream does, just before it fades. Let the colors of tonight's story blur gently together into something calmer, something quieter, something that asks nothing more of you now than rest. Sleep well.